that became part of the way of talking about this, was to talk about healthcare and human rights, because whether you're a Zionist or not, it's not okay for women to deliver at a checkpoint and bleed to death. That's like not okay in anybody's book. So it was like a vehicle to be able to talk about this. And the way that I dealt with the level of sort of secondary trauma that I was having being there was to write.
Welcome to the Miko Peled podcast.
In spring 2023, Miko Peled met with Dr. Alice Rothchild in Seattle for an interview. Alice Rothchild is an OB-GYN who served patients in Boston for decades. She also led medical delegations to Palestine, including the Gaza Strip, and is a longtime active member of Jewish Voice for Peace. She's written several books and created the documentary Voices Across the Divide about the Nakba. Her most recent book is Finding Melody Sullivan, about a 16-year-old American girl who visits Palestine. Links to her books, her social media, and her website can be found in the description. Enjoy the interview.
Alice Rothchild, thank you so much for meeting me and hosting me at your home and serving wonderful dinner.
Great, my pleasure.
You've written books, you've made a movie, you're active on Palestine, you're a feminist, you're really an incredible person with a lot to say and a lot to offer. So I really appreciate your time in doing this interview. I want to mention your website, alicerothschild.com and alicerothschildbooks.com. So you're not part of the Rothschild clan, the famous Rothschild clan. Let's get that out of the way. And just start by telling me about you a little bit, your background and who you are, where you're from.
I'm the daughter of first-generation immigrants. My grandparents came from Eastern Europe. My parents grew up in Brooklyn. They fled Brooklyn as soon as they could. And I grew up in a small New England town. And it started out being sort of Paul Revere made the bell in the church kind of town. And over the course of my young life, about 10,000 Jewish people moved into the town, all fleeing from the ghettos of Brooklyn and Boston, and so it was an unusual town to grow up in. And so I went to Hebrew school 3 days a week. I had a bat mitzvah. My family went to Israel when I was 14, and it was just a miracle of our lives to see this fabulous country. So I came from a very traditional place. My mother was an author, so I had a whole big dose of the Holocaust and immigrant experience, because that's what she wrote about at a very young life, and was very aware of those issues very early.
But she didn't experience it. She wrote about other people's
She wrote about it.
experiences.
She did oral history. Her book is called Voices from the Holocaust, and my movie is called Voices Across the Divide, and I was mirroring my mother and oral history.
And then, I mean, right now you write, and you made a movie. You made a movie, and we'll talk about your book. But you went to medical school.
Yeah, so first of all, I went to Bryn Mawr College, and then I went to medical school at Boston University. I was going to be a psychiatrist, and then I met some psychiatrists who were the most Freudian sexist doctors you could possibly imagine, and I had a major life crisis at the second year of medical school. And I thought, what can a feminist woman do in medicine? I was in medical school before the wave. There were like 10 of us in medical school, women in my class out of 110, that kind of number. So I went into obstetrics and gynecology, and I went into it not because I had met any obstetrician gynecologist that I wanted to be like. I went into it to blow it up, basically, and so that's what I did.
And then, where did you work?
Well, I did my training, and then I opened up a practice with some friends in Boston in the inner city, which got gentrified, and it is no longer the inner city. And so we had a practice that was partly working in health centers, partly private practice. All the feminists of Boston came to us. And also, since it was in the inner city, we had poor people of all stripes and colors and flavors come. And that went on for about 9 years. And then we all had like at least 2 children, and we were exhausted and on call a lot. And we joined a big HMO in Boston, and that's where I worked until I retired.
So I can't help noticing a feminist, socialist tone in your story and in your voice. Can you talk a little bit about that? Where does that come from?
Well, I had a liberal-minded family. My college was not that political, although it was a women's college. But I grew up during the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement, and so I was aware of what was going on. And I did my medical training. Probably the most important year was at Lincoln Hospital in the South Bronx, where I got very radicalized by what I saw in terms of the inequities in healthcare and dealing with poor people and people who were amazingly resilient and had no resources whatsoever. And so I got more and more radical as this went on. And when I went into obstetrics and gynecology, that's an experience that will make any sensible woman a feminist, because the field was so backward and so hostile to women. So I came upon it through my own experiences, through consciousness raising groups, through trying to figure out how to survive in basically a man's world.
So what do you mean by radicalized? And first of all, and then I want to ask you why it was that you say being an OB-GYN as a woman made you a feminist. So, but first, if you could answer both of those.
I went to medical school because I wanted to help people.
Right.
I didn't have a political framework.
Right.
So then I discovered the realities of the healthcare system and the realities of a profit-making system. And I discovered other kinds of healthcare systems. And so I got much more political in how I approached the healthcare as a system of providing care for people. And then I go into this field where, women are called girls and, people get patted on the head and they're there, dear, and have some Valium, you'll feel better. And, just sort of a very disempowering attitude towards women. And I also got involved with the folks who were writing Our Bodies, Ourselves, which became the sort of feminist Bible of women's movement in the United States. And I was one of the students who was reading the text and making sure it was medically correct and that kind of thing. So that whole exposure really changed me as well. I started living in a commune. I mean, I did all these sort of 60s, 70s things that moved me to the left and made me much more aware of how women are disempowered in this system and how to make that change.
So when you say radicalized, you mean politicized?
Yeah.
Now, you said you visited Israel when you were young with your family. Your family was Zionist.
Mm-hmm.
You lived in the commune. You never went to a kibbutz, though. You never went to Israel to experience the kibbutz.
No, my family visited a kibbutz when we were there.
But that wasn't part of your experience.
No,
you didn't
no.
think you wanted to go.
No.
Was there a reason why you didn't, or you just didn't? Was it a conscious thing?
When I was 6 years old, I said, I'm going to be a psychiatrist. I have no idea why I knew about psychiatry.
Right.
So I was very goal-oriented. I wrote a paper on schizophrenia in ninth grade. I majored in psychology in college. I went right to medical school. I didn't stop training until I was like in my 30s. So I never took a gap year. I was a little laser beam kind of person, perfect medical student.
Right. And then the place where our lives merge is Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
And being Jews who are outspoken about the Palestine issue. But you have a niche within that. You're very specific in what you do with that, and it's unique. So can you talk about why you got started with it, how you got started and became aware?
So, as a lefty kind of person with, an increasing understanding of colonialism and imperialism and, World War II and history and all those kind of things, I grew increasingly uncomfortable about Israel. I didn't know enough about what was wrong, but I knew something was wrong.
What made you uncomfortable initially?
I'm not 100% sure. I think it was something about having a Jewish state was uncomfortable to me, but I didn't have the knowledge base and the analysis to really understand what the problem was, but I knew there was a problem. And then as Israel was approaching its 50th anniversary, I got together with a group of people in Boston with the Workers' Circle, Kahil Beira, New Jewish Agenda, and we started talking about what was going on. And we actually participated in the Israeli 50th anniversary. We had a peace forum with a Palestinian and a lefty rabbi and a radical Israeli. And we started getting more knowledgeable and more active. My main education was listening to Palestinians tell their stories, and we just did that over and over again.
Where did that start? Where did you hear Palestinian stories?
In my house on the third floor where we had meetings. I mean, we just networked in the Boston community and found Palestinians who wanted to talk. And we also got a big education from Ruhama Martan, who founded Physicians for Human Rights Israel. And we got a very quick, I started reading the new Israeli historians and doing what you have to do to get knowledgeable. And then what happened was that we thought, my God, people need to know about this. We need to start doing programs and things in synagogues and libraries. And we had no idea what was going to happen to us. And shortly after that, we got really blacklisted in the Boston area.
Who's we again?
This little grassroots organization, Visions of Peace with Justice in Israel-Palestine. And then we were sort of struggling, well, if we can't get beyond this teeny weeny choir, what can we do? And one of the people in the group was also, there were a number of physicians, and he said he'd worked on stuff in El Salvador using medicine and human rights as a way to understand El Salvador. Maybe we could do that in Israel-Palestine. So we started in 2003 organizing health and human rights delegations to the region. We started small. We coalitioned with Physicians for Human Rights Israel and Palestinian Medical Relief Society. And then we started going over year after year after year.
Where did you go?
We did this for like almost 15 years. We went all over the place. So at the beginning, I was interested in going into Israeli hospitals because I was trying to figure out how do these doctors work in this context and what kind of social consciousness do they have. And that got old very quickly.
What do you mean?
Well, I got to understand what the blindness was and what the strengths of their system was. And it became less interesting to me because I wanted to know how were Palestinians surviving and what kind of institutions they had.
You mean like the West Bank and Gaza as opposed to...
Yeah. And I'll just tell you a little interesting vignette. My department head had worked in Israel and was a big Zionist. He was one of the kind of people who would take delegations of American doctors to visit the terrorism response in Israel and that kind of thing. So the first time I was going to go, I went to him and I said, I'm going to go and I'd really like to talk to Israeli doctors. And we had this very civil conversation. And then I said, could you give me the name of some of your colleagues? And he said, no. And it was like he had slapped me across the face. And I said, why? And he said, because you are a danger to the Jewish people, which was my first.
I had somebody say that to me once. That's funny.
My first clue that this was going to be more complicated than I thought. Okay.
You are a danger to the Jewish people.
That's a quote, right? I mean, I wrote
to the
later
Jewish people.
to the entire Jewish people, little me. It was really
that's a statement worth kind of thinking.
It's worth remembering.
Just letting it sink in for just a moment, You are as a danger to the Jewish people.
So, but it was a taste of the kind of pushback that I was going to get.
Was he Jewish?
Oh, absolutely. He was very Jewish. I was at Beth Israel Hospital.
Oh, okay.
That hospital was started in, I think, 1916 because Jews couldn't get admitting privileges at the Harvard Hospital. So it was very Jewish. We had Yom Kippur off. It was like a very Jewish hospital and proud of it. When we merged with the deaconess, the first question was, will we still have Yom Kippur off? So it was an interesting place. No Christmas decorations,
no Christmas decorations.
So anyway, I got quite an education going into the West Bank, working in clinics.
So this is starting when? When did you start?
So I first went in 2004 because I couldn't go in 2003. And then I went almost yearly until the pandemic. I mean, I just went year after year.
Every year to work at different hospitals throughout the West Bank and Gaza?
It wasn't so much working in hospitals. It was coalitioning in solidarity with different groups like Palestinian Medical Relief Society. And we would say, where can you use us? And they'd say, well, the gynecologist in Jenin, this has truly happened, is at some conference in Jordan. Could you go do her clinics? And I would show up and do her clinics with a translator, which was a very challenging and difficult.
Do her clinics means see her patients?
Yeah. Or we went on the Saturday mobile clinics with Physicians for Human Rights Israel.
So tell me about that experience a little bit. So you're in Jenin, working as an OB-GYN with Palestinian women.
Yeah.
You don't speak Arabic. Many don't speak English.
No one
necessarily.
speaks English, no.
Tell me about that experience.
Well, I did this kind of thing for a couple of years. And it was, first of all, incredibly difficult because I didn't understand enough of the culture. I didn't speak the language. I could spend 10 minutes trying to convince the woman that she actually needed a pelvic exam because the other doctor never did pelvics or did an ultrasound. And
did you replace a woman doctor?
Yeah, I replaced a woman doctor.
Woman doctor.
So I was like a Martian that landed, on.
Was there a trust issue? Because of the culture?
I don't. It was just more confusion than lack of trust. And then, I didn't know all the medications. It was just, I felt like I was bearing witness to a very dysfunctional system, and I was getting this amazing education and what women's lives were like, but I wasn't being that helpful.
So how did you overcome these difficulties you described?
I talked with the translator. I did my best. I mean, that's
And
what
you
I could do.
convinced them to get a pelvic exam, for example?
Or not, and then I was like, oh, okay, there's this issue here, and oh, people don't take their clothes off, and oh, no one gets preventive care, and oh, there's no mammography here, and there's a breast lump on this woman, and so people say, well, she has to see a surgeon, and I want to do an ultrasound, and it's like, well, there's so many checkpoints between her and the surgeon, and I mean, it was a different calculus. Everything was a different calculus. So that really educated me as to the impact of the occupation on healthcare. Or, there was a hospital that had a CT machine, but there was a part missing and it was stuck at a checkpoint.
Where was this?
This was in Hebron. I mean, these are, old memories.
This is 2000, early 2000s?
Well, that was probably mid-2000s.
So there's a CT machine, but there's a part missing because it's stuck at the checkpoint.
Right. I mean, things like that, just like, whoa. But besides doing medical stuff, and the pediatricians saw kids, and
Did everybody have similar experiences? Because I think that your specialty is slightly more sensitive and difficult, maybe, especially when you're talking about a traditional society.
I think it was easier for the pediatrician. Because
or an orthopedic surgeon, or
right.
somebody.
So, but our contribution to healthcare was minimal. It was more acts of solidarity. It was more women understood that these crazy Americans came all the way here and took an endless ride in a taxi to get to their village, and that they felt seen. That was part of what we were doing. But it was also our colleagues, our Palestinian colleagues, felt that we were in solidarity with them, it was more solidarity.
So the move from I'm curious about, just growing up as an American Jewish woman. And granted, you were politically aware, and you were politicized, and all of that. But it's not an obvious step, even with what you described as your politicization and your experiences. It's still not an obvious step to feel solidarity, to want to express solidarity with Palestinians.
Right.
By and large, American Jewish community is nowhere near there, even the ones who are very political and progressive. What was it?
I think it was a mixture. I think as a U.S. citizen who's funding this, and as a Jewish American who has this crazy state that says it speaks for the Jews, I felt very responsible. So I felt like I can't turn my back on this. And it became more of a passion for me because I felt so part of I felt like I was coming from part of the problem. And so I had to do what I could do to fix whatever I could fix, or to alert people to what's going on, or to use my white privilege to get people to see what's happening. So, besides doing some medical work, I did a lot of interviews, like with groups like Stop the Wall, and the group in Hebron with Isa Amru, and we made the rounds of every
so progressive medicine. This is now just
human rights. So it was health
rights.
And human rights. So
Gotcha.
There was a big human rights focus.
Yeah.
And then we started making human connections. So we'd stay with families. We'd stay in refugee camps. I went to Gaza 3 times.
Hold on. Let's talk about going to Gaza for a minute.
Yeah.
So the first time you went to Gaza was when?
I think it was probably 2005, because Iyad al-Sarraj was still alive.
2005 was also the so-called disengagement, when the Israeli government pulled out all the settlers and locked up Gaza.
Right.
So did you go before that or after that? Do you remember?
I'd have to go back and look at my notes. I don't remember.
You don't remember?
I do remember that Rafah was completely, they had just created the buffer zone, so we walked through miles of rubble.
You came in through Rafah?
No. We did a tour of Gaza.
Oh, I see.
And that was my first experience of what does the consequence of war look like? What does it look like to stand in this sea of miles of rubble and see children's toys and broken cups and little kids' books? And
where was all this? Where did you see all this?
It's the buffer zone between Egypt.
Just throw.
Yeah. And so that was the first time I kind of got a glimpse of
So
the
you came in 2005,
we came in
you
through
came in from
Erez,
on the Israeli side, and then
we were
go through
hosted by the Gaza Community Mental Health Program.
How long did you stay?
That was probably 5 or 6 days, something like that.
And what did you do there?
Well, we did a lot of bearing witness, and we
To what?
to what the realities of life were, like going to the buffer zone and talking to people who were still hanging on the edges of the buffer.
Medical stuff.
It was all mental health stuff. And so because we were hosted by a psychiatric group, a mental health group, some people saw patients with them. Sometimes we talked with staff. We saw what their facilities were like. And, we talked with people like from OCHA and other human rights-y kind of places.
How many people were you in the group?
That was probably 5 or 6, something like that.
And when you saw the facilities, this is almost 20 years ago. What did you see? What was your impression? In
My
Gaza?
impression was that this was an incredibly difficult place to be doing anything, and that I was talking to people who were so principled and so resilient about what they were doing and so determined.
What do you mean principled?
Well, here I was, a Jewish American, and we were able to connect as people who respected human rights, as, I was someone who wanted to let the outside world know what their reality was, and people were very eager to talk.
And they knew that you were Jewish?
And they knew I was always
didn't
publicly
matter, but
Jewish.
you did.
No, it did matter to me. I wanted, I kept meeting people who'd never met a Jew who wasn't a soldier. And so one of the things I was doing was just having that experience with people to see, there is a Jewish person standing here who doesn't want to take anything from you, who doesn't want to kill you, who doesn't want to hurt you. What's that like? So we had these amazing, intense moments because it was just, that was the reality. It was also, incredibly traumatized, secondary trauma for me. Every time I go to Gaza, I come back and it takes me months to recover because it's such an oppressed place. And it's like, this is optional. People don't have to live this way. This is because of the policies of the Israeli government. And, my government's paying for this. And, you pick up a canister and it has USA written on. I mean, it's not a subtle finding. So this all led to a deeper and deeper engagement, more and more connections, more human connections. The group I was working with in Boston morphed into different, political groups, but we set up an exchange program between Al-Quds University Medical School and Harvard. And so then we started hosting Palestine.
When was this?
When did we set that up?
That's a big deal.
That's a big deal. I don't know, maybe 2010. I don't something in that ballpark.
Yeah, just
so my house became one of the few houses in Boston that had Palestinian medical students staying, and sometimes we'd have 1, and sometimes we'd have 5, and there were a couple of other people who hosted them, and then I got to know all these young people.
So they went to Harvard Medical School. Or
they did it on like a 6-week rotation through Harvard Medical School, through a Harvard hospital, and guess what? Their English was impeccable. They were beautifully educated. They could keep up with the Harvard students without any trouble. They were brilliant. Yeah, it's like, come on. So then I had this intense connection with each of these students. And then, the next time I'd go, I'd have to go visit their families, and then I'd get to know more. But, one thing built on another. So that became part of the way of talking about this, was to talk about healthcare and human rights, because whether you're a Zionist or not, it's not okay for women to deliver at a checkpoint and bleed to death. That's like not okay in anybody's book. So it was like a vehicle to be able to talk about this. And the way that I dealt with the level of sort of secondary trauma that I was having being there was to write. So I started just writing like crazy. I did not go to sleep at night.
When did you start writing?
I think from the start, but I got much more compulsive about, I did not go to bed without having a complete writing of what happened that day.
So every day while you were there?
Yeah. I was like famous for someone who didn't sleep. I didn't sleep. People would be all asleep and I'd be in the stairway writing. At first I did it on tape, and then I was like, that's ridiculous, because then I have to transcribe it all. So
the reason I ask is because my process, I can never write when I'm in it. I can only write once I'm back.
Yeah, no.
And then I open the door and it all
no,
comes out.
I have to do it.
Never write when I'm
day
there.
by day. So I come home with copious amounts of
and
information.
Did you intend to publish it?
So what happened was that in 2003, I ruptured a disc, and I was out of work for 2 months, and then sort of went back, not feeling good, blah, blah, blah. And 2 years later, I had a spinal fusion, and I was out of work for 1.5 years. And during that time, a friend of mine who's an editor said, you've got to take all of this stuff and write a book. And I was like, yeah, right. I'm on Percocet, I'm miserable, I'm going crazy. She said, write that book. So I did. And being a very goal-oriented person, I said, I'm not writing a book unless I have a publisher, which was a ludicrous thing to do. So I wrote to all my academic friends and said, I need a publisher. And out of the blue, Pluto Press emailed me and said, I want to publish you. And it's a kind of funny story because I was like, oh my God, now I have to write a book. Exactly. So I started, and they wanted, the table of contents and the marketing plan. So I did this for a while, and I thought, this is ridiculous. I can't do this. So I stopped answering him, Roger Zwanningberg.
Right.
And then a couple of months later, he said, I'm going to be in New York. Meet me there. And I'm like, Alice, this publisher is chasing you. Do not pass this up. So I loaded up with Percocet. My husband drove me to New York. I got into my nice clothes. I met him at a fancy restaurant. He's there with his ponytail and his sneakers. And he says, look, you have a story to tell, and I want to publish it. And I was like, okay, fine, I'll do it. So that became my project for my leave.
And when was it published?
Okay, so Broken Promises, Broken Dreams was published.
What was the title again? Say it again.
Broken Promises, Broken Dreams, Stories of Jewish Trauma and Resilience, and Jewish and Palestinian Trauma and Resilience.
Jewish and Palestinian. So you talked about Jewish
trauma.
What was the Jewish
because
trauma?
It was my journey. So
your trauma.
It was more coming from a Zionist family, anti-Semitism, Holocaust, blah, 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 love of Israel. Oh my God, look at the occupation. I was getting everybody in. And I did the whole sweep. But mostly each chapter was about someone who taught me something, an Israeli or a Palestinian.
So each one of these things you just laid out as a chapter, not a book.
No, each one's a chapter.
Okay. Each one
It's a journey. It's a personal journey.
Yeah.
And then a second edition was published and it was translated into Hebrew and German. And so I got the sort of like, ooh, that was fun.
Hebrew.
Well, yeah, I was very determined to get it published in Hebrew and Arabic. So I found a publisher in Haifa. I don't even remember the name of it. I actually went to visit him and published it in Hebrew. I spent a lot of time trying to find an Arabic publisher and could not find one.
So they
I paid for translation. Yeah.
Okay, that's very interesting because none of my stuff is published in Hebrew at all.
I felt like, hey guys, you got to know this stuff. Okay. So then what happened was that I got the writing bug, and I started writing for like Mondo Weiss, and I had for about 7 years I had every year, once a year, the Boston Globe would publish an op-ed by me about Israel and Zionism and Palestine. And then they decided not to do that anymore. But, I started getting published. So this was interesting. And so then I was...
And were you still practicing medicine?
Yeah.
Or by that, you were still practicing medicine?
Yeah. So then what happened was that I was in Israel and the West Bank right before the 2014 war. And I was like nuts because I could just see that this was how you make a war. You add a little of this and you add a little of that and you stir it up and you poke someone in the... And there was going to be this horrific war in Gaza. And it was like, my blogs are like screaming like, hello, do you see what's happening? Blah, blah, blah. So I got
Screaming
home.
To who?
To whoever would read my blogs, to the world, to the universe. It was so clear to me, the dynamic of what was happening,
for sure, yeah.
and that no one was paying attention. So I get home and the publisher of Just World Books calls me, Helena, and she said, I've been reading your blogs and they need to be a book. And I was like, oh, a publisher drops out of the sky and wants to publish my blogs. Fine. So she did a very quick, 3 months later, the book came out. And then she had the dibs to do a second book. So we decided for the second book to take a much broader sweep of blogs, clean them up because they were all written, in hallways and on buses and things, and to write more analysis. So my last book was Condition Critical, Life and Death in Israel, Palestine. And meanwhile,
what's it about?
It's about my blogging day to day, like my compulsive blogging every day. But it's
there's got
also
to be a theme. I mean, the book's
the theme.
Random.
The theme is the impact of occupation, human rights violations, all the stuff that I bore witness to, and analysis about the behavior of Israel and imperialism and colonialism and settler colonialism. I got more sophisticated as I...
And these two books, just to stop there for a minute, what kind of response did you get? What kind of...
I mean, I book toured. It's a little publisher. I did the best I could to market it. I don't have a good sense of how many.
No, but I mean, in terms of response, was there any response from anybody?
Well, I would
Jewish
do a book
friends,
tour,
I mean,
and
people who were...
people would come, and there would be one. I mean, sometimes people would scream and yell and have to be taken out by the police, and sometimes people were all like, "Thank you for writing this book." I mean, the whole spectrum. And then in the midst of this, I accidentally made this documentary film, Voices Across the Divide.
Hold on, before you get to that, I have to tell you something. So you talk about all these just absolutely unbelievable experiences that would each one of which would fill out a whole life. You're talking about them like and it reminds me, and maybe that's where you, I don't know, maybe it's you, but maybe it's because when I talk to Palestinians, like I'm in touch with friends in Gaza, and I worked with some young writers in Gaza and stuff like that, and that's what they do. They'll go, well, yeah, so in 2008, all these people were killed, we attacked, and there's a blockade, and then 2009, all these, and I go, whoa, slow down. So tell me again, what happened in 2008? Oh, so talk about that. So your house was blown up, and your neighbor's children were killed in front of your very. But slow this thing out, and it's interesting because you talk the same way. You go, and each one of these things, I'm like, thing. Whoa, let's let that sink in for a minute. So you wrote 2 books about your just incredibly deep and thoughtful experiences, seeing the enormous human rights abuses, seeing the conditions of hospitals in the West Bank, and the conditions as a result of the. Basically, you saw the results of this oppression in the areas that you that I could see that are specific for, to your field, and beyond the human rights as well. And you wrote about it. That's a lot. Now, and again, I'm going to go back to this issue of you being a Jewish American woman and spending so much time and putting in so much thought and effort into this issue and feeling responsible. And I can't but think, well, wait a minute, why are there not like 10,000 Jewish American women doctors who are doing this? Where are they? And how is it not? How is it that they are seeing what you saw? And you made an effort to see more, but basically, and you're just not there. And we talked about this earlier before we started recording about this issue of the very, very progressive American Jews who are parts of all these organizations and are, for all the right, support all the right causes and all the right issues. And then you talk about Palestine and it's done.
Right.
So talk to me about that, what you think that's about. Why is it done? And why was it not done with you? Why is it done with them?
Right.
Why was it not done with you? And can we learn something from this?
I mean, I think that people are, progressive except Palestine people who are otherwise very decent, lovely people, because Jews are very invested in their victimhood, their story of being the big victim with the Holocaust, and that for Jewish people to admit that there was, that the price of founding the state of Israel was the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians is so painful and so out of their imagination that they can't bear to go there. And also, because no one wants to be the bad guy. No one, and Jews, I mean, my mother used to say, Jews are moral people, they don't rape, they don't steal, they only take what's theirs. Jews are decent people. And everybody wants to be that decent person. And I understand that. We all want to be that. I do this because I want to be a decent person. But once you make that connection, then you have to be in a place of apology and reparations and recompense and mending the ills. And people don't want to go there. And I understand why they don't want to go there.
So how did you end up going there?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. But you had asked me about the response to me, and I just thought of this story where at my department with the very Zionist chief, people would go, there was an earthquake in Afghanistan, and some obstetrician would go off to Afghanistan and do blah, blah, blah. And then they would come back and do grand rounds. And I thought, well, if they can do grand rounds, then I should do grand rounds. So I petitioned, and here I've been at this hospital for decades. And I said, I want to do a grand rounds.
What's a grand round?
Oh, a grand rounds is a once a week meeting in an academic hospital, but I think community hospitals probably do this too, where there are educational events. And sometimes it's, how to read fetal monitor tracing and how to do better electrolyte balance, but sometimes it's more about the world. And I felt as a staff member who travels to this place and knows a lot about this place, that I should be allowed to talk about it. And he said no. And he said no, and he said no. So, I felt, oh. So finally he left. And I thought, now's my chance. So there was a temporary chief, and I said to her, I want to do a grand rounds on the impact of the Israeli occupation on healthcare and human rights. And she said yes, because she wasn't Jewish and wasn't Zionist, and she didn't know any better. And I said, fine. And I was going to do, UN statistics, not politically overtly. And, I was at a hospital presenting facts about human rights violations. So when my grand rounds was announced, she got 100 emails demanding that this grand rounds be canceled.
From who?
From my peers,
Oh.
from doctors in the hospital. I had trained at this hospital. I had worked with everybody there. I was well respected, but this was a line, the Progressive Accept Palestine line. And so she called me into her office and she said, look, I'm going to let you do this, but don't screw up. So I was like, thanks a lot. So this was sort of anxiety provoking, but I, over prepared as usual. And I called all my friends who were in the healthcare field and I said, you come to this grand rounds. The place was packed. The opposition did not show up. I gave a very professional, data-based, with all my photos that,
What year was this? I'm sorry.
Oh, what year was this? God.
More or less.
You're asking me for things I don't remember.
More or less.
Early 2000, maybe 2010, 12, something,
Okay.
That kind of thing. And everybody lived. And people applauded, and I got a standing ovation, So that's the range.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
So, go on. So you wrote these two books.
So, I've written Broken Promises and then the two books with Just
Right,
World
right.
books. And then,
And then you made a movie by accident.
and
You
then
said you
I
made a
made the movie by accident. I was planning to write a book about the stories Palestinians tell me spontaneously when I'm talking. And the interviews got filmed, and I was convinced to make this into a film. And it turned into a 4-year project. It was a very powerful experience for
The
me.
title is?
Voices Across the Divide, available on Vimeo. Premiere
So it's available
on
for anyone,
Vimeo.
on
Yeah.
yeah.
There's a website with resources and guides.
Why'd you call it Voices Across the Divide?
Well, partly because the film is Palestinians telling the story of the history of the founding of the State of Israel and the ethnic cleansing of Palestine and 67.
And these are Palestinians that you talked to here in the U.S.
This is all U.S. Palestinians. This had to be easy. Spoke English. Some of them were, came, people who'd experienced the Nakba and came. Yeah, everybody had to have experienced whatever they were talking about. So I wove together the whole history by taking people's stories and weaving them together. And the filmmaker, the co-film editor person, Sharon, I'm now blocking on her last name, Sharon, said, you have to be in this movie. And I said, no, this is not my story. And she said, no, you have to be in. And we had this whole conversation. And we decided I had to be in to invite people into the dance. So I had to be, hi, nice Jewish lady, blah, blah, blah. Look what I found out. Oh, my God, So these were voices across this divide. I was also mirroring a book title of my mother's, which was Voices from the Holocaust, because she was also...
So you created a parallel here.
Yeah. I was evoking a parallel.
Yeah, yes.
So, and then, the movie...
Did you get in trouble for that?
From my mother?
Well, in general, I mean,
No.
No.
It
was subtle.
A little independent movie, no one's going to...
It was subtle.
It was subtle, right. And, it won an award at the Boston Palestine Film Festival and has a little life of its own. Every year at the anniversary of the Nakba, a couple of different groups show it, and I'm on a panel. And so it lives on. And I think it still stands as a very powerful documentary, but also very accessible to people who don't know. It's for people who don't know.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm like living my life, and then I'm retiring, and then I'm moving to Seattle to be near my daughter who's going to have a baby, and life goes on. And I was giving a talk, and this Quaker teacher says to me, "You should write a book for kids on Palestine." And I said, "I don't write children's books. I read children's books. I do not write them." And that night I dreamt a picture book.
It's very interesting how resolute you are about
I'm
something.
very resolute.
And then the next day,
Right.
you just go.
I'm
the
a
other-
cliff jumper, you know?
Then the next day something happens.
So,
and
you
go the
you
other
dream
way.
a picture book, you write it down, and you get, how many words is a picture book? So this sparked my interest in this topic. So I got here and realized I know bupkis about picture books or anything about children's books. So I joined.
Bupkis meaning nothing. Just in case
Bupkis
somebody
is
doesn't
Yiddish
know.
for nothing, you know. I did sing in the Yiddish chorus for 20 years, so I know lots of Yiddish curse words and things. So anyway, so
You do a
I...
Yiddish curse word from the chorus.
No, I'm being funny.
From singing.
I can sing heroic marching
There we
songs in
go.
Yiddish and lullabies.
There we go.
So anyway, so I, took courses and joined societies for writers and blah, 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 and figured out.
So in other words, you had no idea how to do this, the bupkis
So
reference.
I
you
taught myself.
So you taught yourself.
And I got into a
So this is one of those things, you're rushing through it.
Yeah.
But this is a big
This
deal.
is how
So
I do
somebody said
things,
to
right.
you,
Do
write a
this,
kid's
yeah.
book. You said, absolutely not. And
then
the
I
next
do
day
it,
you
right.
get up and you start learning it,
Right.
taking the time and the effort
Right.
to learn how to do
Because
this.
it was like a whole population that knew nothing. So it was like not talking to the choir. If I could write books for kids, then kids would learn about this. Wouldn't that be exciting?
So isn't it too sad and tragic and horrible to talk to kids about this? How do
No,
you overcome
No.
that?
So my picture book turned into a middle grade chapter book. That's like 7 to 12. And that book,
7 to 12
years old,
years
kids.
old. Okay.
Yeah. So that book, which is yet to be published, has an interested publisher, but anyway, it's a long
Yeah.
story, is about a little boy and his grandmother. And the little boy is a 4th grader. He has a sister who's in high school who wears a hijab. They get into all sorts of trouble in school.
And they live in Palestine.
No. They live in, actually in Worcester, but it never
Okay.
says Worcester.
Okay.
And so he gets into this big crisis of who is he? Why does his name have so many Mohammeds in it? Why does his mother pack hummus every day? All the things that a kid might get into trouble with. And his grandmother decides to tell him her story.
Is this based on a true story?
No, I made it up.
You made it up.
So the grandmother's story is written in the first person present. So she gets these flashbacks. So there's the little boy and his sister, and the sister, they call her a terrorist, and all, and then the grandmother, I take all the major points in the history of Palestine and create a story of the grandmother's experience of that at that age. And so, I took, I mixed all the people I'd interviewed for my movie and all the people I'd met in Palestine. And, I created a story that was
Now, this
plausible.
hasn't been published yet.
No, it needs to be published.
Absolutely.
So it's not a sad,
Not at all.
it's not a tragic movie. It's about a boy discovering who he is. And, there's a tremendous amount of food in it because Palestinians are fabulous with food and they're always feeding you. And, my critique said they're always hungry when they listen to me read my chapters, And when you write a book and you start sending it out to publishers, that's like sending it off somewhere. So you're supposed to start the next book. So I got this idea. I wanted to write something that was much more problematic and not such a nice story. So I thought I could do a graphic novel because you can do a lot of violence in a graphic novel but not have to say anything about
You draw?
violence. No, I would be the writer
And
I would
get
find
somebody.
an artist. So this idea came to, and I was also very worried about what they call writing outside of your lane.
I'm sorry, are you familiar with the book Mouse?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So I read all the graphic novels and Joe Sacco and blah, blah, blah. And I got this idea. And I also worked with a graphic artist who happened to be living in the apartment building I was in. So I learned how to physically, it's written like a play, scene 1, panel 1, blah, blah, blah. So I wrote this novel about a cat that lives in the Shuafat refugee camp because I felt like I know cats and I can't be accused of writing not in my own voice because it's a cat.
The
But
Mouse is about mice and you wrote about a cat.
Yeah, but it's a cat who is like represents Palestinian kids and is
But
very
why
feisty.
let me stop you again. Why Shuafat refugee camp?
I picked Shuafat because no one knows there's a refugee camp in Jerusalem. And I thought it was very important for
Do
people.
you know people there? Have you been there?
I haven't been there, but I've been to a lot of other
yeah.
refugee camps. And also because at some point the cat when the water gets shut off, the cat decides to go to Jerusalem. So I wanted to have a refugee camp that she could easily follow the rail that what's it called, the light rail into Jerusalem with her other cats and bear witness to Jerusalem. And
I got to tell you, this is absolutely brilliant.
It's very smart. And so
I'm glad you agree. I'm glad we agree.
So the problem is that I wanted to have a Palestinian graphic artist. And so I've worked with several that fell apart for all the reasons that things fall apart in Palestine.
Do you have one now? Because
I do have one now that lives in Gaza, which is a hard place to be exchanging artwork. But he has done half of the book, and I'm now in the process of going through all of his artwork and editing it and upgrading it.
Can you tell us who he is? His name?
I think it's premature to do that. And I don't.
Okay.
I want to see the book finished, and I have an interested publisher for that. So while I was trying to work this through, because dealing with an artist who doesn't speak English well, who did all the dialogue right to left instead of left to right, and we had to get everything left to right, lots of things, but a brilliant artist. I decided to write a memoir in verse. I know this is crazy, but I really wanted to write about becoming a feminist doctor and growing up in the 50s and, not getting to stop before I hit Palestine. So it's until I'm about 45 or so. And these poems just started coming to me. So I actually wrote a memoir in verse. And there was a publisher who wants it, but they want to publish it as a, what they call hybrid model, which is I put in 50% of the cost and they put in, and I want it to be really published. So anyway, so while I was trying to find that publisher, my daughter had a home birth, and I thought, I'm an obstetrician, and I went to her home birth. I actually caught the baby, and it was this incredible experience. I should find out more about home birth in Seattle, because in Massachusetts, home birth was very taboo, and it was kind of underground. And it turns out home birth in Seattle is has a home birth school for direct entry midwives, and it's one of the preeminent midwifery schools in the country. So I've been just interviewing all these midwives, and it's just a whole nother feminist medical history stuff. So that's all going on while I'm trying to get these books published. So that's what I'm doing.
You're a woman of many, many talents. Many talents. I'm really glad we're having this interview. I'm really enjoying this, because like I said, we met at the intersection of Palestine, but you've taken this to a whole 10 different amazing, incredible directions. So,
the other thing I do, I work with We Are Not Numbers.
Yes.
So,
I do too. So, I did at least. Yeah.
So, this is sort of what happens to me. I was a mentor. This is a group that mentors Gazan writers 18 to 30 and gets their English to a place where it can be published on the website. Everybody's writing their personal stories. Again, a really powerful way to know what's happening. And then I get asked to be in charge of all the mentors, and story of my life. So I'm in charge of the mentoring process. I match all the mentors. I help all the writers that have mentors that aren't responding fast enough, all that stuff. So I got very involved with this organization, and
I was involved in it for a little bit.
You're on my list of mentors.
Yeah, I mentored 2 or 3, and one of the girls I mentored, Mariam, she's back in Gaza, and she just sent me the absolute cutest video of her daughter as the missiles are falling.
Oh my God!
I'll show it to you after. I mean, it's absolutely the cutest thing on earth. So I want to talk a little more about politics now.
Okay.
Kind of big picture politics. So you mentioned a couple of times being an American, feeling responsible, being American, feeling responsible, being American, feeling responsible. So what is happening in America? Why is America paying for this? Why is America sending weapons for this? Why are Americans just sitting quietly and letting it happen? I mean, it's a lot of questions. But why? I mean, because this is something. This is like the $3.8 billion question, right? Why? What's happening here? What do you think is happening here that is I don't know, like fundamentally wrong here?
Well, there are so many fundamentally wrong things about what's going on in America. First of all, so you're sort of implying if people knew, they would be different.
I don't know. I'm asking you what you think, but let's talk. I agree with you. There are many things fundamentally wrong. Let's talk about this particular.
Early on,
the root of this, if you will.
There are several layers to this. So, post World War II, guilt, Holocaust. No one wants to be called an anti-Semite. Guilt.
America had nothing to do with the Holocaust.
I know, but
defeated
But they
the
didn't
Nazis.
allow the immigrants to come here, people who
Right.
were fleeing Nazi Germany. A lot of guilt issues. So everybody was going to stand with Israel. And then I think Israel was very useful to American foreign policy.
I'll just say one more thing about that. In the 1960s, in La Jolla in San Diego, there were still homes that when you bought them, in the deed it said they could not be sold to Jews.
Yeah, no.
1960s. Now La Jolla is
my
full of,
parents
it's a Jewish
bought a
community.
house so I was a senior, 65, and there was a covenant in that neighborhood.
Yeah.
We were the first Jews to, yeah.
So I mean, this is going
This
way
is go
past
way back.
19
So-
Holocaust and all
right,
this. Yeah.
So there was a whole stand with Israel, the whole everybody's a kibbutznik, blah, 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 socialist, labor, we love Israel. And then I think as things came along, the 67 war, the whole propaganda about the 67 war and Israel's existential threat, and people made aliyah, and people bought that. And
So
then,
I'm just want to interrupt you again. So you're telling all of these processes, and
Yeah.
you were here as they were going, and you never got swept in them. It seemed like
No.
to me. So you're kind of slightly away from
I'm
it,
a pre-med student.
and you see
I'm
all
like,
this stuff happening.
you got to remember, I was trying to get into medical school. I was, I was
Yeah,
not
for
like,
whatever reason.
I was
Yeah.
not like tuned into all this stuff.
Yeah.
And I got very alienated by religion. So I wasn't like, a super Jew when I got to college. So that helped me not see
Yeah.
all of this happening. I think that the big turning point was 9/11, when people felt very afraid of Islamic terrorists, the whole,
Turning point in what way?
in terms of people really choosing not to think about the consequences of Israeli policy because they got swept up in this fear of the Islamic world, and we've got to fight the terrorists. And now Israel, Israel said, the Israeli leaders said, now you understand our situation. That I think that people really bought that. Okay, and so, and also people, you have the whole Christian evangelical movement, which exploded after 67. And it's not just white Christian evangelicals, it's Korean evangelicals, it's Hispanic evangelicals, it's an enormous swath of America. Takes the Bible very literally and really thinks that all...
So are all these things happening organically,
Yeah.
or is this something from the outside influencing?
Both. I think, we're both aware there's a huge propaganda industry, there's a huge, Hasbara industry that keeps pushing all this stuff. It's like with the current IRA definition of anti-Semitism, which, the IRA, Israeli Holocaust Remembrance Alliance group in 2016, had definition of anti-Semitism, the classic stuff, and then a lot of examples were any criticism of various forms of criticism of Israel.
Yeah.
They didn't mean that to be the final moment. It was a working document, but it got accepted. State Department, states, everybody. Okay.
Communities, colleges,
Right.
churches.
And now this is being pushed at every level. The Port Authority in Seattle adopted the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. Excuse me, it's a port. This means that there are propaganda groups that are infiltrating at all these different levels, pushing for this to happen. Otherwise, why would this be? So there's a whole industry behind this that is making this kind of stuff happen. And we just had a big fight here with the I want to get this right, the King County Council, I think it is, and they were going to, someone comes up to a council member who knows nothing and says, "You're against anti-Semitism, right?" Oh, of course, just sign here. And then we're like, whoa, let's look at what this says. And we finally got them not to sign it and to reject the IRA definition. But any little schlemiel in every little council everywhere, you against anti-Semitism? Oh yeah, well, sign here. So you can see how it just becomes the norm. And then, there are all these moves to make criticism of Israel inherently anti-Semitic. Well, this is across the country. And then you have, if you support boycott, you've seen the movie Boycott, it's very pernicious, and it's going on all over the place. And then you have a huge, let's not forget, the military-industrial complex that is all interwoven with Israeli military. That's a huge amount of moneyed interests and political interests that make it very hard to break this wall.
You're saying part of it's organic and part of it is just feeding this whatever is
Right,
organic.
feeding the monster.
Feeding the monster.
Right.
Because there are people that I know, and you may have heard of them, you probably know, I'm not going to mention any names, but they say, oh, everything was great here, but then the Zionists came and corrupted America.
Right, right. Right.
Yeah. So you don't agree with that?
I'm
asking you as an American. I'm not asking. I'm not.
I don't know what corrupted America means. There's, America's
Yeah.
a settler colonial state long before Zionists came here. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're struggling with our enslavement of black people. Yeah, we have a lot of sins that we need to.
That had nothing to do with
struggle
Zionism, but yeah,
right. Zionism is on the list.
preceded that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think, the positive thing is that younger generations aren't buying this like the older generations did. The sort of Holocaust generation is dying out. I see when I go to universities that more and more young people are like, wait a minute, if it's not okay to discriminate against people in the United States, why is it okay to discriminate against Arabs in Israel? Young people are raising those issues. So I think that there may be a shift in American opinion, but Congress is owned by the Israel lobby. Now we have, Rashida Tlaib and, various
A couple of more progressive
people, which would have been unheard of 20 years ago. So things are shifting, but it's shifting at a snail's pace. And how many people in Gaza are going to die before there's a shift?
So that's the question I want to ask you.
Right.
Things are moving very, very, very
Yeah,
slowly,
yeah.
And we know that there's going to be another attack, and we know that another Palestinian is going to be killed in Hebron, and we know another Palestinian is going to be killed in Jerusalem, and we know, there's an epidemic of murders in the communities in 1948 of murders, and so how do you think? This is a tough question, but do you think there's a way to accelerate this? Do you think there's a way that people of conscience can convince members of Congress and other elected officials, like school board members, whoever it is, mayors, people that go on these junkets, that it needs to stop?
Right.
Is there a way that we can kind of accelerate this process by facing these people, by confronting them?
Right.
Is there a way to do that, do you think?
I don't know. I think we have to be loud and persistent, but it's not like I have a staff of 100 people that are tracking all of this and we all make our strategies. That's what we're up against, right? So I think we just have to keep doing what we're doing, but to do it louder and more often and more persistent. And, it's like my representative in Congress is pretty hopeless on this. We meet with him. We have these endless conversations with him. He's sort of a J Street two-stater, I care about Palestinians, but kind of guy. He's not going to change. So, Well,
he's not going to change unless he's forced to change, unless he thinks his job's on the line.
Right. And his job is not on the line.
It's not going to be on the line.
No. So it's tough, I think, but it's not that we shouldn't do it. It's like the guy who's the head of the Al Rawad Children's Theater always says he does not have the luxury of despair. So who are we to be despairing?
I think it's a good place to stop. Thank you again for this conversation. It was a real pleasure talking to you, and see you next time.
You're welcome. It was fun.